Well, thank you very much. It's a huge pleasure to be here. I'd like to start by thanking David Watts not only for organising this fantastic event, but for putting me up in his house overnight, and also thank his wife Wendy for cooking me a lovely dinner last night, and just a pleasure to meet them both. So Richard Dawkins already been mentioned by the Bishop and I think by David as well, so almost no talk on science and Christianity is complete without a quotation from Richard Dawkins. So this is one on miracles, and it comes from Forbes magazine and an article called Snake Oil and Holy Water. So I admire Richard's tremendous facility with language and with words. This is what he says: the resurrection, even the Old Testament miracles, are all freely used for religious propaganda, and they are very effective with an audience and unsophisticates and children. So if you believe in miracles, you know what you are. Every one of these miracles amounts to a violation of the normal running of the natural world. If you go to an encyclopedia, and this is a very popular one, Wikipedia, a miracle is an event not explicable by natural or scientific laws. And if you go to a famous treatise on miracles written by David Hume some years ago, it was called Of Miracles. A miracle is a transgression of a law of nature. So I think probably most people in this room would agree with this definition of miracles. And what Richard Dawkins says, and what David Hume also says, is that a miracle is a transgression of a law of nature, and we just know from experience that you cannot transgress laws of nature. So for example, if I reach into my pocket and pull out a coin, if I release it, I know with certainty that will drop to the floor. Right? I won't let it drop to the floor. But, So this is the problem which scientists have with miracles, because if miracles broke the laws of nature, and we know from our experience that laws of nature cannot be broken, then how can we believe in miracles? And of course, it's not just a problem for scientists, it's a problem for lots of people as well, but a particular problem for scientists. Augustine's been mentioned. This is what Augustine of Hippo said way back in AD 400 or thereabouts. Very great Christian scholar. And listen to what he said. He said, miracles are not contrary to nature, but only contrary to what we know about nature. All right? So if he was alive today, I think he would say miracles are not contrary to science, only contrary to what we know about science. And if our understanding of science was better, we would see that the miracles don't contradict science. And why did Augustine say this? He said this because his belief in a God, as both the Bishop and David have said, God is the creator and upholder of the universe. He's a consistent God. That's part of his character. And if God is consistent, will he break the laws he's established? And Augustine said no. And so what we see is that what Augustine says and what Dawkins and Hume say, they are contradictory, right? Dawkins says all miracles, and Hume, transgress a law of nature. Augustine says no, they don't. If they appear to, it's because we don't understand nature well enough. And you may well say, okay, Augustine lived a long time ago and people don't believe what he said today, but quite a number of people do. All right, the majority will side with Richard Dawkins, but quite a number will adopt this line. And just let me mention one. This is Rowan Williams, the previous Archbishop of Canterbury, who's a significant scholar himself. And I was at dinner in Rowan Williams College, Magdalen College, Oxford, and I was one of the guests at dinner, a number of guests. And before the dinner, he was just moving amongst the guests and talking to them briefly. And as he approached me, I thought, what will I say to him? And I know he's a prolific writer, and so I said, Rowan, are you writing anything at the moment? And he said, no. He said, but I've just written a book about Augustine. So I said, do you know what Augustine said about miracles? And he said, yes, I do. And I said, do you agree with him? He said, yes, I do. And I said, do you think the resurrection is consistent with what Augustine said about miracles? And he said, yes, I do. And then the gong went for dinner. And one of us was saved. So, this is a digression, but an important digression. Jesus was asked by some lawyers amongst the Pharisees, I think, what is the greatest commandment? And the Gospels indicate that this was a trick question. So my assumption is that they expected he would give one of the 10 commandments as the greatest commandment, and they prepared, a response to each of his answers to the 10 commandments, showing him why it wasn't the greatest. That's my guess. But Jesus chose not to give an answer that was a 10 commandment. He chose something that Moses said later. And Moses said later to the Israelites, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. And then Jesus says that's the greatest commandment. Maybe I'll just digress slightly more. It's actually quite interesting. If you go back to Deuteronomy, you'll find that what Deuteronomy says is, in our Bible, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. It doesn't say with all your mind. So why did Jesus apparently add this in? Well, obviously for effect, but also Jesus was actually quoting from not the Hebrew Bible, which would have been used in the synagogues, in the temple, but from what's called the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Bible, done by Jewish scholars in about the 2nd century BC, and they have this in. So in some ancient, they were translated from the Hebrew. Some ancient manuscripts did include with all your mind. The Hebrew text used in our Bible and in the synagogues then didn't have this in. And by Jesus putting this in, he was giving it real emphasis. And what he was saying was, you worship God with your heart, so you worship God emotionally, with your soul, so from your inner being, with your mind, and with all your strength, both mental and physical. So Jesus says to us, if you're thinking about miracles, or if you think about anything, you switch your mind on. And people like Richard Dawkins tend to give the impression, if you're a Christian, you're brain dead, right? And it's not the impression that Jesus says we should worship God with all our mind, and so we should think seriously about miracles. If you're a scientist, you should think as seriously, and a Christian, you think as seriously about miracles as you think about your science or any other aspect of Christianity. Before we move on, what are physical laws? So David's spoken about that very well. This is a quotation I like from Richard Feynman's book. He's a Nobel Prize-winning physicist. If any of you know about Richard Feynman, he's also very famous for playing the bongo drums. And this is what he said about physical laws. There is a rhythm and a pattern between the phenomena of nature which is not apparent to the eye, but only to the eye of analysis. And it is these rhythms and patterns we call physical laws. So what does he mean about not apparent to the eye and not apparent to the eye of analysis? Well, it is because although a lot of things are apparent to the eye, with some things our eyes can deceive us. And a very simple example has already been quoted is when you look out the window now, we see sunshine, we look up to see the sun, and we see the sun going around the earth, and so that's what we think is happening. But when Copernicus and Galileo used the eye of analysis, they said what was really happening is that the earth is going around the sun. And when that starts as a theory, but when it's really established, it's given the status of a law, and so that's what a law is. It's looking at rhythms and patterns in nature. And just note in passing that physical laws are based upon repeated, reproducible events and experiments. And a one-off observation cannot constitute a physical law, and that's something just to remember perhaps about miracles. So what does the Bible say about miracles? The Bible calls them signs and wonders. It does not call them supernatural events. The distinction between natural and supernatural is a late development. It started in about the 17th century AD, right? So the Bible, basically, all events are due to God. So it calls signs and wonders. This is a quotation from the book of Exodus. The Lord said to Moses, see that you do before Pharaoh all the miracles I put in your power. Then a later quotation, then the Lord said to Moses, though I multiply your signs and wonders in the land of Egypt. So the signs and wonders phrase is almost used interchangeably for miracles. And then in the New Testament, Peter, talking on the day of Pentecost, says, Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs. So this is the miracles Jesus did called wonders and signs. And also the miracles themselves attest that the man doing them is chosen by God. So Moses performed miracles, and that's, as it were, the stamp of God upon Moses saying, this is someone I've chosen. And this is why the people of Israel gave Moses some respect. Not all the time, but by and large gave him respect to lead them out of Egypt. And similarly with Jesus of Nazareth, Peter is saying, he's attested by God because of the miracles he did. This is one reason for believing in God, is to look at the miracles. So miracles are really important. And we notice if you read the Bible, go through the books in the Bible, miracles are not scattered uniformly through the Bible. They're concentrated at specific times, and they're particularly concentrated around the time of Moses, Joshua, and Jesus. And if there is a God, and if there is a God who performs miracles, then you might expect God to perform them, mainly when there are these climatic events in religious history. So the Exodus was one of these events, the coming of Jesus another of these events, and that's what we find. This is when we find the miracles concentrated. So I'm going to now go from the general to the specific, and we'll talk about two miracles and look at them in detail. And one is the Old Testament miracle of crossing the River Jordan, where, as we will see, and many of you will know about this, as we will see, the Israelites were on one side of the River Jordan. They've been waiting for about 40 years to get to the other side, to their promised land, and the Jordan suddenly stops flowing, and that's one of the really most important Old Testament miracles. It's the climax of the Exodus story. And then the other miracle is the resurrection of Jesus, where, as we know, Jesus was raised from the dead, or Christians believe he was raised from the dead, and after his resurrection then came into locked rooms, for example, and then his body ascended, as it were, defying gravity at the ascension. So before I go on, for reasons that may become clear, I'd like you just to think in your mind, if you're a believer or not a believer, if these events happened as described in the Bible, are they both miracles or not? And I would hope that all of you would say they are miracles, even though you may not believe in them, they are miracles, because they're such remarkable events. And what I want to do is to take an approach what I hope is both biblical, looking through the eyes of someone who believes the Bible's the Word of God, and also scientific, and explore both these miracles. And also ask the question, are there different types of miracles? And an interesting link, there's a link between these two miracles, and this is something I realized only recently. I should have realized it before. If you go to Matthew's Gospel, before Jesus was born, then God spoke to Joseph, and God said to Joseph, "You're to give him the name Jesus." And I didn't think much of this. I thought, okay, Jesus was a name that was given by God. But I just realized quite recently, Jesus, of course, for many of you will know, is the Greek for the Hebrew Joshua. So God is saying to Joseph, and no doubt Joseph instantly told Mary, God says we could call him Joshua. And just think of the effect on Moses, the effect on Mary and on Joseph, the parents of Jesus, that their son, there have been all these remarkable sequences of events before his birth, and then they're told he's going to be called Joseph. It's going to be called Joshua, sorry. And of course, we don't know the language in which Joseph heard God speaking to him. He may have been speaking to him in Hebrew. And there's also a theory that the earliest form of Matthew's Gospel was in Hebrew, and someone called Papias, a second century Christian, says this. And if that's the case, then we've lost these earliest versions of Matthew's Gospel, where it would say you're to give him the name Joshua. So why was Joshua important? I mean, the parents of Jesus would have thought back, why is Joshua important? They would have known, of course, Joshua led the people of Israel out of their meanderings and wanderings into the promised land. And then Jesus, they thought, may well do the same. And of course, we believe he has done this. He's led us into the promised land of heaven at the end. So there's this similarity, in a sense, between these two miracles.
Raise that a little bit.
Okay, right. This is a height adjustment, yes. Right. Okay, if I stand closer to it. Okay, let me stand closer to it. Right, thank you. So crossing the River Jordan, it's the last miracle of the Exodus, as I've said. In a sense, it's the climax. And so let's look at this. Let's read the story through the eyes of a scientist, or through the eyes of science, and let's ask this question, to which Richard Dawkins and Augustine of Hippo give different answers. Does it amount to a violation of the normal running of the natural world? So this is a story, and it's expressed really very clearly and succinctly in just two verses, which will be familiar to some of you. Now the Jordan is in flood all during harvest. Yet as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a heap a great distance away at a town called Adam in the vicinity of Zarethan, while the water flowing down to the Sea of the Arabah, which is now called the Dead Sea, was completely cut off. So the people crossed over opposite Jericho. Well, let's just picture the scene in our minds. So the writer's saying that River Jordan was not flowing normally, it was in flood, so it's a particular barrier, difficult barrier to cross. The Israelites were on one side, they wanted to be on the other side. This was their promised land of Canaan. Ancient Canaan corresponds to modern Israel and Palestine. They'd waited about 40 years for this. They could see the promised land across the river, but the situation looked hopeless because the River Jordan was in flood and it was just rushing down so fast. The snow had melted on Mount Hermon, so that was the source of the Jordan. And then suddenly, the water stopped flowing. It was as if someone had a giant tap and they turned this tap off, water stopped flowing, and the Israelites crossed the riverbank in triumph. So what would happen if you went and told this story on the streets of Manchester, for example, today? Then I think the reaction you would get would be, what a wonderful children's story, right? Great fairy tale. And that's a very reasonable reaction because the story sounds so preposterous in a way that this can happen. So that's a reasonable reaction. And in this room, many people, I think, or some people anyway, will have the same reaction. And it's a very reasonable reaction. But can it be true? And can we know when this happened about 3,000 years ago? And as we said, many people, also many biblical scholars, believe the story is a legend. Now, there is a strange detail of the story, which you may have realized as I was reading it. And the key question, of course, is did the writer intend it to be factual or not? Or was it written as historical fiction? That's fiction dressed up in a sort of historical wrapper. What did the writer intend, and what does his audience understand? And let's just look at this detail in the account of crossing the Jordan. And some of you will have noticed this, but let me just start reading it again, and then I'll stop where the detail is. So the Jordan is in flood during the harvest. As soon as the priests carried the ark, reached the Jordan, their feet touched the water's edge. The water from upstream stopped flowing. If this story is invented, you will continue, and almost certainly they would say the water piled up by the feet of the priests. But it doesn't say that. It says it piled up in a heap a great distance away. So the writer's saying this miracle didn't happen where the Israelites were. It happened somewhere else, which is a fairly remarkable thing to say. And then the writer at pains to emphasize this because he says where it happened. It happened at a place called Adam. And if you don't know where it is, he tells you where it was, the district in the vicinity of Zarethan. So here's the writer, this great miracle, the climax of the Exodus story, saying the miracle happened not where the Israelites were, it happened somewhere else. And to me that has a huge ring of truth about it, and it's not the sort of thing you would invent. So this is the curious thing. And he says the water stopped flowing a long way upstream, a town called Adam. And so certainly if you're a scientist, but I think if you're anyone not a scientist, you say, what stopped the water flowing at Adam? And can we possibly find out 3,000 years later? So let's just look into that. So the writer really does intend this to be factual. You know, in the text he wants to point to where everything happened. He doesn't just say the Israelites crossed the Jordan, he says they crossed it opposite Jericho, so he's pinpointing where they crossed. He then says the water stopped flowing a great distance away, but he pinpoints where that was, a place called Adam. He says all these places are upstream from the Dead Sea, which is true. So he's trying to root this story both in geography and in history. So where was Adam? So if you look on a modern map, which I have done, then you'll find no place called Adam on a modern map. And that's not surprising, because hardly any place that existed 3,000 years ago still has the same name today, right? So either that place has disappeared totally, or else the name has been changed. A few names have survived. Jericho, for example, has survived for 3,000 years, and that's one name that survived. But many names haven't, or they've changed, and it still goes on. So I was in India 18 months ago, and went to a place called Mumbai, which used to be called Bombay. Many of you will realise, and Bombay becomes Mumbai. So this keeps going on. But sometimes when names are changed, then there's a certain similarity between the changed names. So Mumbai and Bombay, have a certain similarity. We need to know a little about the Hebrew language to understand what's happened. So Hebrew language, the ancient Hebrew text was just consonants, and they had no vowels. Now, of course, when you read it, you had to put vowel sounds in, or if you read it in your mind, you put vowel sounds in, and it's like modern text messages. So many of you will use text messages, and you'll know if you write the word text on a text message, you usually write TXT. You don't put the E in. And then in your mind, when you read this text, TXT, you just put in the letter E. You know it's text, not tixt or toxt or tax, so you put the right vowel in. And so that's what the Hebrew language was like. It was these consonants. And so if we look at the Hebrew text for the word Adam, A-D-A-M, then the consonantal, what's called the consonantal root, is just D and M. And they would have a breathing sound in front, in fact, like Adam was how it would be pronounced. And then if Arabic words replace the ancient Hebrew words, as they do in many cases, then, as we'll see, there's places in modern Jordan, then what happens is the rules are that you drop the breathing sound and you add an Arabic ending. And this is how, with a number of ancient place names in the Bible, replaced by modern Arabic names, you can trace back to what the ancient biblical names are. So what we need to do is to look on a map of around the River Jordan for suitable towns containing these consonants, DM, which are retained. And there is a place, sorry, and it's called Damia, so there's the D and the M, and sometimes it's spelled D-A-M-I-A, and sometimes D-A-M-I-Y-A, and it's on the east side of the River Jordan, and it's about 17 miles north of Jericho. And I put here, most scholars are agreed, ancient Adam is modern Damia, and in fact, I think all scholars are agreed on this. I haven't found one who doesn't say this. And let's look at it on the map. So here's the map, and you'll see at the top there is the Sea of Galilee, and then the River Jordan runs down to the Dead Sea, and it's a simplified map, it's an accurate but simplified map. There's a Mediterranean Sea on the left, and at the end of the Exodus story, the Israelites were coming up on the east side of the Dead Sea, so they came up through Edom and through Moab, and then what the writer says is they crossed the River Jordan opposite Jericho, so you can see where they would have crossed, and then there's ancient Adam, modern Damia on the map, something like 20 kilometers higher up. So that's the geography of the situation. And I think you'll ask, how did the writer of the book of Joshua, how did it know where this event happened? And I think he was curious. I think the Israelites crossed the River Jordan, and he would see that the water hadn't stopped there. He'd see that, the water stopped somewhere upstream. And so he sent some of the Israelites and said, go up and find out what's happened, right? And they found something had happened, this place called Adam. And so that's how it was recorded in Scripture. Let me now put some science into this, the clue of the earthquake. So on the 11th of July, 1927, there's a very well documented earthquake which shook Jericho. Buildings collapsed, walls collapsed, you may be interested to hear. It was detected around the world, in Europe, USA and Russia. The magnitude of this earthquake was 6.5 on what's called the Richter scale. And just for comparison, there was an earthquake in Christchurch, New Zealand, which I think we'll all remember, on February 22nd, 2011, which sadly killed over 200 people. And this was slightly less strong. That was 6.3 on the Richter scale. And why did this earthquake happen in Jericho? It was due to slippage along what's called the Jericho Fault. And the fault runs, I'll show you a map in a moment, the fault runs along the River Jordan, and we'll have a look at it. But before we do that, this is a person called Professor Muir, who's made a study. He's a great expert on earthquakes. He's a professor of geophysics at Stanford University, and I wrote to him about this because I knew he'd made a study of it. And I said, can I quote your letter? He said, yes, you can. So I'm quoting his letter. And this is what he wrote to me. He said, during the 1927 earthquake, several ground cracks appeared together with an outpouring of groundwater. This soil liquefaction phenomenon has been well observed in earthquakes elsewhere. During the earthquake, mudslides occurred along the River Jordan near Damia. So this was the 1927 earthquake near Damia, ancient Adam, about 30 kilometers, that's 18 miles north of Jericho. These temporarily stopped the river's flow. And the next slide shows an earthquake which happened in 1957, which didn't stop the river's flow, but it almost did. So you can really visually see what's happened now. So this is near ancient Adam, and there was 1957 an earthquake. You can see the mudslide going across the River Jordan, and the River Jordan diverts around it. And you can see if it was a bigger mudslide, and it would just cut it off completely. Right? So we now get a visual impression of what happened in 1957, but something bigger happened in 1927. And then there are historical records of the Jordan stopping previously. So this is a letter from Professor Near again to me. Adam is now Damia, the site of the 1927 mudslides which cut off the flow of the Jordan. Such cut-offs, lasting typically 1 to 2 days, have also been recorded in 1906, 1834, 1546, 1534, 1267 and 1160, and then the records stop. You may well think the records are extended back to 3,000 years. The stoppage of the Jordan, he writes, is so typical of earthquakes in this region that little doubt can be left of the reality of such events in Joshua's time. So now we ask the question, was the crossing a miracle? Because I think we can say with reasonable certainty that this is how the event occurred in Joshua's time. Right, an earthquake-induced mudslide behind which the waters of the Jordan piled up, and typically they break through 1 to 2 days later. They either go around it or they come over the top of this mudslide, and that typically takes 1 to 2 days. So plenty of time for the Israelites to cross. And we know that's what happens in modern times. In modern times it happens in Damia. We know that modern Damia was ancient Adam, and that's the place the book of Joshua says this miracle happened. So we have a very consistent story, which science working together with the Bible, I think, can explain. The Old Testament describes this as a major miracle of God. And before we move on, let's just note this is now consistent with Augustine's views of miracles and not with Dawkins' view for this miracle. So this miracle, Augustine says, we haven't broken any natural laws, right? We can understand the mechanism of this in terms of natural laws. So it's not consistent with the Dawkins view of miracles. Now, the story in the book of Joshua doesn't talk about an earthquake, but there are some hints in different places of the Bible. This is one of the hints, this Psalm 114. When Israel came out of Egypt, the Jordan turned back, right? So he's talking about Jordan. The mountains leapt like rams. When the Bible talks about mountains leaping, that normally means an earthquake, when the mountain is shaken. The hills like lambs, and then tremble, O Lord, at the presence of the tremble, O earth, at the presence of the Lord. And I think most people would interpret this tremble, O earth, as symbolic, right? But I don't think the psalmist is saying that. He's saying there's an earthquake. This is what happened. He's relating it to the Jordan turning back, and he's saying the presence of the Lord was there at this earthquake. So, I think that is a hint that is an earthquake, which was the mechanism and appreciated by the Old Testament writers. So now let's have a look at how Israel might have understood this. So as I said before, Israel, not only Israel, it was Israel, Egypt, Babylon and so on, they had no words distinguishing between natural and supernatural events. All events were controlled by God. In Egypt, all events were controlled by their gods. They had many gods. Israel had one God. So all events due to God. So to the ancient Israelites, if an earthquake had caused the Jordan to stop, it was just as much the hand of God as if God had sent an angel or God had come down and snapped his fingers, as it were. So why was it a miracle? It was because of the timing. If this miracle had happened a month before the Israelites were there, it would have been meaningless, or a month afterwards. So the miracle was in the timing. Just to mention briefly another miracle, perhaps the best-known miracle in the Bible, the crossing of the Red Sea, where you remember the Israelites were trapped by Pharaoh as they were leaving Egypt. And this is what the Bible says about that miracle. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. So here the Bible's very explicit. It was a natural mechanism. No angel came down. God used natural force. This was a strong east wind that blew the water back. And this, again, it's a known scientific effect. If I had a beaker of water here and blew across the top, you'll blow the water out the other side of the beaker. And the force of my breath blowing across, I won't do it, but blowing across the water forces the water out. And if you have a strong wind blowing along a long body of water for many hours, that water is gradually forced back. And in fact, it's what's called a steady state position, takes a number of hours, and the water can be forced back a long way. And if that's water's on a sloping shoreline, then shipwrecks can be exposed, for example. Lakes, some of the great lakes, like Lake Erie in America, a strong wind blowing along Lake Erie produces a height difference of the water. I think the record is 15 feet, just huge from one end to the other. So these, both miracles, I think, have natural explanations, and the miracle is in the timing. So the Jordan stopped just when the Israelites were there, the Red Sea driven back just as the Israelites are going to be trapped by Pharaoh's army. This is, I think, a remarkable passage from this psalm talking about miracles, and it just shows this deep understanding of the scientist. You are the God who perform miracles. You display your power among the peoples. Your thunder was heard in the whirlwind. Notice, not thunder, it's your thunder, it's attributed to God. Your lightning lit up the world. The earth trembled and quaked, so there's the earthquake. Your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters, though your footprints were not seen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. So here's the psalmist talking about miracles. He ends the section talking about Moses and Aaron, so he's specifically talking about miracles at the time of Moses and Aaron. And he talks about earthquakes and so on. And the sentence or the phrase I like the best, well, which I think is most remarkable in this, is though your footprints were not seen. Right? So it's not saying that God came down and pushed the water apart and, walked across the Jordan, pushing it apart, leaving his footprints. I shall shout, leaving his footprints in the muddy riverbank. His footprints were not seen. God was operating in a subtle way. Right? He didn't leave a visiting card as we might today say if someone's out, you say, God was here, Postman visited. It was subtle, right? And but you look at this event because you believed God is in charge and you know that God was there performing this marvelous miracle of timing. So let's picture the scene. River Jordan now is not very impressive. So many of you will have been to Israel and Jordan and seen the River Jordan, and I did this, and my first reaction was, because the River Jordan was basically from where that seat was to this wall, and I thought, why didn't they swim across, right? That's my first reaction. And what you have to realize is that since 1940, both Israel and Jordan have used huge amounts of the water from the river for irrigation. We're told earlier in the book of Joshua that the Israelites crossed in the spring. It was the 10th day of their first month, called Nisan. The source of the Jordan is the Mount Hermon, covered with snow. The snow melts in the spring, and so the river floods. And this is a photograph of the Jordan in flood in the 19th century, before water was withdrawn, and you just see it's huge. Right? This was the barrier that was facing them. And Britain has an expedition to Jordan in the 19th century, and they said it was half a mile wide, and even allowing for some exaggeration, perhaps, this is what the expedition reported, just a huge barrier. And so I think after 3,000 years, I think we can know where and how the crossing occurred. And the idea of miracles being a miracle of timing is not new, but I think it has been largely forgotten about by the Christian church, and I think we need to get back to this. This is what Aristotle said. Aristotle talked about miracles, and he talked about the efficient cause, and this was a natural agent, so in this case an earthquake. The final cause was the will of God, so he said God is in charge, here's the final cause. He said, how do you know this event's a miracle? And he says, by the extraordinary timing of the event. So what we're saying is, God, in this case, didn't break any laws. He worked in, with, and through the nature he created and upholds to perform this great miracle of crossing the Jordan. So let me conclude this section. we can say that this miracle, and I think some other miracles, are miracles of timing. Maybe not all, and we'll come to that, but some are. And God is working in, with, and through the nature he created, and God works through ordinary things of life, and God may interact with people to achieve these miracles of timing. Let me just speculate. You can say, how is this miracle of timing achieved? And I don't know, but I can speculate that as Joshua was leading the Israelites through the wilderness, God was speaking to him and say, Joshua, you need to hurry up a bit, or you're going a bit too fast, or slow up. I mean, that's one way this miracle of timing could be achieved, with God interacting with someone who was just tuned in to the mind of God. And I think this is something for us to realize today, because when you realize that God works miracles through natural events, and he works through humans to achieve these miracles of timing, then that's something that I think we need to be aware of, all right? And I think these things are probably achieved through Bible reading and prayer, and I certainly don't do enough. But I think this is something that we can be used by God if we're alert to the possibility that these miracles of timing occur today, and we can be used in this. So people and God working together can make miracles of timing. This is a nice quotation, I'll just end this section by. The scientist, even when he's a believer, is bound to try as far as possible to reduce miracles to regularities. This is what scientists do. We're trained to do this, reduce everything to regularities. So we don't throw away our science when we read the Bible. We try and do this. The believer, even when he's a scientist, discovers miracles in the most familiar things. And scientists have to, realize there are miracles out there and not lose their sense of wonder. Okay, what happens if the miracle appears to be a unique event? So let's have a look at the resurrection. And I think if this is true, I really think it is the most incredible event in the whole of history, right? Someone is resurrected from the dead, who then goes on to appear in rooms where the door's locked and has the ascension and so on. Just amazing events. It's either true or it's a cruel hoax. I'm not going to give evidence of resurrection. I'll just say one thing here. This is one part of evidence. That Paul, writing to the Corinthians, says he appeared to over 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living. And that statement, most of whom are still living, is clearly correct, because we know that this epistle was written about AD 55, about 20 years after the resurrection, which I think was the 5th of April, AD 33, so you're talking about just 20 years after the event. So let's say 500 people were living in AD 33. By AD 55, probably 300 were still alive, something like that. So most were still living. And I think Paul is saying you can actually go and speak to these people. You can go to Jerusalem, you can talk to them, you can interrogate them. And there's 300 people you can talk to, and they'll all tell you that they saw the risen Jesus. And I think if one of those people said it was nonsense, this is just fake, it's fake news, to use the latest new word, then it would have destroyed the whole idea of the resurrection. So these sorts of arguments are really quite powerful, that the resurrection really did happen. So can science explain the resurrection? So this is where I start to disagree now with Augustine of Hippo, because the question is, were natural laws broken at the resurrection? And if we knew more science, would we see that natural laws weren't broken? And I think natural laws, if I look at it dispassionately, really were broken. And we have to remember that the resurrection wasn't only the resurrection. I mean, Jesus raised Lazarus, and Lazarus, we all presume, went on to die again, and he would be sick and suffer. If he fell over, he broke his leg, for example, he would. Jesus, after the resurrection, appeared to his disciples in a locked room, and this is emphasized in the Gospels. And then there was the ascension, when Jesus appeared bodily to go up into the sky again, defying gravity. So there were so many strange things which happened to Jesus after the resurrection. I think physical laws were broken. I don't think there's any way around that. So I actually think Augustine is wrong when he said that. And I think Dawkins is right. If you believe in the resurrection, then physical laws were broken. So what can science say about this? So, as I said, it's a problem not only for scientists but for theologians, because the argument of Augustine is a good argument. He said, would God break his own laws? So if God is a consistent God, would he break his own laws? I'm now going to give you a picture, which I call the music analogy, which I find quite helpful. And this is this picture. So let's imagine there's a piano in that corner of the room, and someone's playing the piano, and you come into the room, and you go and stand beside them, and you see they're not playing with any music at all. You just watch their fingers on the keys, and every so often you'll find they don't play the note F, they play F sharp. And they keep repeating this. And if you're a musician, if I remember my music right, then they will deduce that they're playing a piece in the key of G minor, because a piece of music, the composer issues instructions to the person who's playing it how to play the music, and at the start of each line of music there's what's called a key signature, and if he wants something to be played in the key of G minor, then he puts an F sharp in at the time, and you don't play a white note for the F, you play a black note. And so a person watching, doing an experiment, if you like, watching the person play, he can deduce the key signature. And that's what scientists are trying to do with the universe. They're trying to look at these repeatable events, like playing a black note instead of a white note, and saying, this is how the universe operates. It's a scientific law. Now the person continues watching the pianist, and he seems, every so often, quite rarely, he doesn't play F sharp, he plays F. And occasionally puts in an A flat or a C sharp. And the person's not surprised. He says, that's an accidental. And the composer's put it in. And if it's a great composer, then it's not a capricious thing to do. It actually makes better music. And if you doubt this, and I've tried this myself, if you're a pianist or a violinist or something, take a great piece of music which has got accidentals in and play it with and without the accidentals, and it just sounds so much better with the accidentals in. It's what makes that passage really great. And so basically the composer is the composer, and he is free to break his own rules, right? And that's important. He is free to do that. But if he's a great composer, it will make better music, not worse music. And every so often in a piece of music, the composer has a whole bunch of accidentals just for a few bars. And this is a change of key signature. So in middle of a piece of music, you'll find suddenly there's a change of key signature just for 1 or 2 bars, and then you turn back to the original key signature. And that's for something which is a really dramatic change of the key signature. So how do the Gospels present the resurrection? And is it presented as God acting capriciously? And this is what Peter says on Pentecost, just 7 weeks after the crucifixion. God raised Jesus from the dead because it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him. I mean, the argument is if Jesus really was the Son of God, then death cannot keep its hold on him. So the resurrection was not incredible, it was inevitable. And so the resurrection, Peter is saying, is consistent with a consistent God. So, I'll shortly be finished, right? I know I'm keeping you from your lunch. I'm here between you and your lunch. Let's just have a little bit more of a look at the resurrection. And Paul devotes a chapter in Corinthians to discussing the resurrection. And this is the first thing he says about it. Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. So what does he mean by this expression, first fruits? Well, let me just say what he means quite quickly, because it's referring to a first fruits festival. I think we know when the days of the crucifixion was. The Passover lambs in the book of Exodus, they were sacrificed on the first Jewish month of the year, the 14th day. It's called Nisan 14. And in the first century AD, there were so many lambs to be slaughtered that the book of Exodus says between the evenings, that's probably between sunset and the first stars appearing. The first century Jewish historian Josephus, so many Passover lambs to be slaughtered, they actually start at 3 p.m. in the afternoon to get through them on Nisan 14. Here's Matthew's Gospel saying that Jesus died at the 9th hour, and it's measured from sunrise, which is about 6 a.m. So Jesus died at 3 p.m. So here's a remarkable coincidence that Jesus died at the same time as the first Passover lambs were slain. And we can also deduce very clearly, I think, from John's Gospel, Jesus died on Nisan 14, which was a Friday. So, and I've done some work, as some may know, that Jesus died at 3 p.m. on Friday, the 3rd of April, 1833. And Paul, writing about the crucifixion, says, Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. So it's an analogy between Jesus dying and the Passover lamb. And it's an exact historical analogy in that this happened at 3 p.m. on Nisan 14. So this chronology is exact that underlies the symbolism. And just to say in passing, unless someone commits suicide, it's very hard for anyone to control the date of their own death. And so this remarkable timing is a pointer to God. It's like the other miracle. I think it is a pointer to God, that it's evidence, if you like, for God. So let's now move on to the meaning of the first fruits. If you go to the Old Testament book of Leviticus, then there was a first fruits festival of barley on the 16th of Nisan. It's specified in the book of Leviticus. And what happened was the priests would go into the fields and they would cut some barley from the fields, and they'd come back to the temple, they'd wave this in the temple. It was called a wave in the sheaf. And until that happened, the barley could not be harvested. The priests had to do that. It inaugurated and enabled the harvesting of the barley. If the crucifixion was on Nisan 14, then the resurrection was on Nisan 16. So when Paul says, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep, we have another exact analogy that Jesus resurrected on Nisan 16, the precise day when the priests would go into the barley fields, harvest the barley, and then inaugurate the barley harvest. So the chronology of Paul's symbolism is again exact. And just as the waving the first sheaf of barley enabled this harvest to start, so the resurrection of Christ enables those who have died to be resurrected. So it's a very nice analogy. But then Paul goes on to say questions which we ourselves may ask, perhaps not so much when you're younger, but when you get a bit older you may start asking this, or when a relative dies you may ask this. When someone dies, how are the dead raised? In what kind of body will they come? And Paul says, the resurrection of the dead, the body that is sown is perishable, it is raised imperishable. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. For the perishable must clothe itself with the imperishable. So it is a different body. It is what he calls a spiritual body, not a natural body, and it's imperishable. So okay, I think 1 or 2 slides are missing. Never mind. No, that's okay, right. They're not missing. So it's a spiritual body. And I think a slide probably... Just let me say this. So let me just check. Are the slides missing? Yeah, okay. Right. Those slides have not come through. So basically, and this is speculation, and scientists speculate, and Christians can as well. So I think... if Christ could come through locked doors, his resurrected body was clearly different, but it was recognizable, but maybe not instantly. So Mary did not instantly recognize. She thought he was the gardener. The people on the roads to Emmaus did not instantly recognize him, although they probably knew him. So his body looked slightly different, but it was recognizable. So we know our body, which has been a DNA body, carbon-based, that is subject to decay and death and suffering. And so if you think of a different body, then it is like a change of key signature. So the resurrection of Jesus, let's go here, it was like a change of key signature. And so this means, I think, different physical laws operate. It's a body to which different physical laws operate. The slides weren't missing. So our old body was DNA carbon-based. Our new body, I suggest, our resurrected body, it's very tentative, was probably not carbon-based. Person still recognizable, no more disease and death. And scientists, a lot of scientists believe in a multiverse, which I know a lot of Christians worry about, and perhaps not so worried. The Bible talks about a new heaven and a new earth, and maybe, this is another universe, a multiverse, in which there are different laws of science. And the resurrected body of Jesus and us will be there with different laws of physics, operating according to a different key signature. So this is really the last slide, I think. So I think there are at least probably 3 types of miracles. Type 1 is a miracle of timing, where no natural laws are broken, and scientists have no problem with that. Type 2, some miracles like an accidental on music score, maybe when Jesus and Peter walked on water, you can think of God providing an uplifting force to counter the force of gravity, uplifting them as they go across. That's like an accidental, a one-off event. Again, science cannot comment on this. It doesn't break any laws because laws are for repeated events. Then the resurrection, like a temporary local change in key signature, a glimpse of new and different physical laws for the risen Jesus and for us, indeed, after death. And again, science cannot comment on this because, again, this is like another universe with different laws existing. So can a scientist believe in miracles? And my answer is yes. Thank you very much.